In 1991, inside a foam-lined government testing room in Ottawa, a budget Canadian box made a mockery of high-end luxury audio. The speaker was the PSB Alpha. In strictly controlled blind listening tests at the National Research Council, this inexpensive vinyl-wrapped cabinet consistently defeated imported audiophile models, costing 5 to 10 times its price. It proved that a speaker, a device that turns an electrical audio signal into sound moving through air, could be perfected through objective measurement rather than subjective guessing. Reviewers were stunned. Global competitors were embarrassed. Suddenly, anyone in Canada with a basement rec room or a campus dorm shelf could afford absolute acoustic truth. But that triumph created a paradox. PSB had proven that honest, neutral sound could be manufactured efficiently. Yet over the next 3 decades, the brand would discover that the modern retail floor does not always value acoustic perfection. The real story of PSB is not just how Canada learned to measure sound. It is the story of what happens to pure objective engineering when the living room around it completely changes. Every week, we tell the stories of Canadian speakers, amplifiers, audio labs, and listening rooms that once shaped how people heard music, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in a quiet workshop in St. Jacobs, Ontario in 1972. In 1972, the Canadian domestic audio market was largely a colony of foreign engineering. If a listener walked into a hi-fi dealer, a dedicated stereo shop where audio components were demonstrated, compared and sold, in Toronto, Montreal, or Vancouver, the premium shelves were dominated by heavy American monitors and highly polished Japanese electronics. Canadian-made speakers existed on the margins, but they were often built in small batches, relying on a deeply flawed historical design philosophy, the guessing game. At the time, a speaker maker would build a cabinet, the wooden, plastic, or composite box that holds the drivers and shapes how the speaker interacts with the air. Wire up the components and simply listen. In the rural farming community of St. Jacobs, Ontario, Paul Barton was trying to build something better. A classically trained violinist with a deep, physical understanding of natural acoustics, he and his wife Sue founded a small company named PSB. Barton would play his violin in his workshop, put down the instrument, and then immediately play a recording of that exact same piece through his prototype speakers. He was looking for the absolute truth in reproduction. But human hearing is a moving, unreliable target. What sounded brilliant and detailed on a Tuesday morning might sound harsh and fatiguing on a Friday afternoon. A speaker that sounded perfectly balanced in a plywood workshop in St. Jacobs might sound entirely different when placed in a carpeted basement rec room in Calgary. The wood, the glue, the crossover, an electrical network inside a speaker that sends bass, mid-range and treble to the drivers designed to handle them, were all being tuned to a ghost. The problem was not the craftsmanship or the dedication of the builder. The problem was the complete absence of an objective Canadian standard. You could not mathematically prove that a speaker was accurate. You could only argue that you liked the sound. That changed permanently in 1974. Barton packed a pair of his early PSB speakers into his car and drove 500 kilometers northeast to Ottawa. He was heading for the National Research Council, a federal government facility that housed some of the most advanced acoustic measurement tools on Earth. There, he met Dr. Floyd Toole, a researcher who was in the process of completely dismantling the mythology of audio design. Toole had access to an anechoic chamber, a test room lined with massive fiberglass wedges designed to absorb all sound reflections so a speaker can be measured without the room interfering. When Barton placed his carefully ear-tuned speaker into the chamber, the resulting measurements were a revelation, and a harsh one. The anechoic chamber did not care about the heavy varnish on the cabinet or the passion of the builder. It only cared about frequency response, how evenly a speaker reproduces low, middle, and high sounds. The paper graphs showed the invisible acoustic peaks and valleys that Barton's human ears had missed, or that his workshop's acoustic reflections had naturally masked. This was a pivotal, irreversible decision for PSB. Barton realized immediately that building a speaker based purely on personal taste was an engineering dead end. From that moment forward, the Canadian brand tied its identity entirely to the NRC. They would rigorously measure the woofer, a large driver designed to reproduce low frequencies such as bass and drums. They would meticulously measure the tweeter, a small driver designed to reproduce high frequencies such as cymbals, strings, and vocal detail. They would measure them on-axis, off-axis, at high volumes, and at low volumes. They combined these objective measurements with strictly controlled, double-blind listening tests, ensuring that the listener never knew which speaker brand was playing. The guessing game was over. The science of Canadian speaker design had been born. But having the mathematically correct measurements inside a federal laboratory did not guarantee a single sale out on the retail floor. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the early fruits of this research began to emerge from the St. Jacobs facility, including the highly regarded Passif 1 and Passif 2 models. These speakers represented a massive leap in accuracy. They were honest, they were neutral, but honesty is a remarkably difficult concept to sell in a crowded, noisy showroom. A hi-fi dealer in 1978 was a chaotic commercial environment. Walls of competing speakers were wired to massive switchers. Customers would walk in, a stereo salesman would press a button, and the loudest, most dramatically voiced speaker, often with artificially exaggerated bass or piercing treble sparkle, would immediately grab the customer's attention. A perfectly neutral, NRC-measured PSB speaker could easily sound flat or reserved during a quick 10-second retail demonstration. Furthermore, building a cabinet that did not resonate, sourcing high-quality drivers, and engineering a complex crossover based on strict data required serious capital. Sourcing the heavy wood, the vinyl veneer, and the skilled labor in Ontario was not cheap. Canadian manufacturing costs were steadily climbing. The brand was fighting a war on two fronts: the technical challenge of perfecting the sound in Ottawa and the retail challenge of surviving the audio showroom across the country. The early PSB models earned immense respect from audio engineers, a growing number of serious reviewers, and specific dedicated stereo stores that understood the uncompromising NRC philosophy. Audiophiles who trusted measurements began to seek them out. They found their way into university dorm rooms, small independent studios, and dedicated domestic listening rooms where critical listening was the priority. Yet despite the undeniable proof of their performance, the company was still largely a regional player, a highly respected acoustic secret hidden in the vast Canadian landscape. The objective truth had been successfully captured in the wood, the magnets, and the wire. The science was finally correct. The next problem was convincing a Canadian hi-fi dealer to actually sell it. By the early 1980s, the Canadian audio landscape was trapped in a financial paradox. The National Research Council in Ottawa had successfully proven what a perfect loudspeaker should sound like. The science was settled. Through exhaustive double-blind testing, Dr. Floyd Toole and researchers like Paul Barton had discovered a universal psychoacoustic truth. When listeners could not see the brand, the size, or the price tag of a speaker, they almost unanimously preferred the same acoustic profile. They wanted a flat frequency response, an even, uncolored reproduction of low, middle, and high sounds, and wide, smooth dispersion, meaning the sound radiated evenly off the sides of the cabinet into the listening room. The math was undeniable. The problem was the physical cost of building the math. A speaker, a device that turns an electrical audio signal into sound moving through air, is fundamentally an industrial object. It requires heavy wood, copper wire, magnetic motors, and physical labor. In the 1980s, manufacturing a large, acoustically inert cabinet The wooden enclosure that holds the drivers and shapes how the speaker interacts with the room was becoming increasingly expensive in Ontario. Canadian labor costs were rising. Shipping heavy wooden boxes across the second-largest country on Earth was eroding profit margins. PSB had achieved critical respect with early models like the Project B and the Passive series. These speakers proved that the anechoic chamber, the completely dead, reflection-free testing room at the NRC, produced audibly superior results. But these were still relatively expensive niche products for dedicated audiophiles. Barton realized that building an accurate speaker with an unlimited budget was merely an exercise in procurement. The true test of the NRC measurement culture was whether the science could be applied to a strict, unforgiving budget. If the math was the secret, could you force cheap, mass-market components to perform like luxury audio? The answer arrived in 1991. It was called the PSB Alpha. Physically, the Alpha was entirely unremarkable. It was a small, utilitarian, vinyl-wrapped rectangular box that looked like it belonged on a cheap bookshelf rather than in a dedicated hi-fi listening room. It utilized a basic 6.5-inch woofer, a large driver designed to reproduce low frequencies such as bass and drums. Above it sat a simple 0.5-inch tweeter, a small driver designed to reproduce high frequencies, such as cymbals and vocal detail. On paper, the Alpha looked like a generic, disposable entry-level product. But inside the cabinet, Barton had applied thousands of hours of NRC acoustic data. The secret lay in the crossover, an electrical network inside the speaker that sends the bass to the woofer and the treble to the tweeter. In budget speakers, crossovers were usually afterthoughts, slapped together with cheap capacitors that caused harsh spikes in the frequency response. Barton used the anechoic chamber to meticulously tune the Alpha's crossover, smoothing out the physical imperfections of the cheap drivers. He mathematically forced the woofer and the tweeter to integrate seamlessly. The cabinet was braced exactly where the resonances were highest. Every single penny of the manufacturing budget was allocated strictly to the acoustic performance, being leaving nothing for luxury aesthetics. When the PSB Alpha hit the Canadian hi-fi dealers, the local stereo shops where audio components were actively demonstrated and compared, the retail shockwave was immediate. Priced at roughly $200 Canadian, the Alpha was pitted against imported British and American bookshelf speakers costing 5 times as much. In traditional dealer showrooms, salesmen would line up the Alpha next to expensive luxury brands behind an acoustically transparent curtain. They would run double-blind listening tests for their customers. Time and time again, the cheap, vinyl-wrapped Canadian box won the room. The Alpha did not win by being louder or by artificially boosting the bass to trick the ear. It won by being invisible. It reproduced the stereo image, the illusion that sounds come from specific places between and around two speakers, with a precision that budget audio had never achieved before. The soundstage, the perceived width, depth, and placement of the music, stretched far beyond the physical boundaries of the small wooden boxes. Audio magazines and international reviewers, historically skeptical of budget gear, were forced to acknowledge the measurements. The Alpha received universally glowing reviews in the United States and Europe. The National Research Council's philosophy had been completely vindicated on a global scale. The measurements did not just apply to high-end luxury audio. They could be used to mathematically hack the budget market. The cultural impact within Canada was profound. The PSB Alpha became the default recommendation for a generation of listeners. It was purchased by university students outfitting their first dorm rooms. It was bought by young professionals for small Toronto apartments. It found its way into basement rec rooms, independent recording studios, and secondary bedroom systems across the country. It replaced cheap plastic boomboxes with actual, mathematically proven hi-fi sound. For the first time, a Canadian audio brand had successfully democratized the objective truth. You no longer needed a massive bank account to hear exactly what the mastering engineer heard in the studio. You only needed $200 and a small shelf. But a $200 speaker, no matter how brilliantly engineered, operates on razor-thin profit margins. To survive as a business, PSB could not simply remain a boutique manufacturer making clever budget boxes in St. Jacobs. The dealer network was expanding rapidly. Orders were flooding in from the United States and Europe. The supply chain required capital, logistics, and international distribution that a small independent company simply did not possess. The little speaker had democratized Canadian hi-fi, but survival in the global audio market would require an entirely different scale of power. The PSB Alpha had conquered the university dorm room and the small apartment. It proved that Canadian acoustic science could dominate the entry-level market. But in the audio industry, true institutional power is not measured on a bookshelf. It is measured on the floor of a dedicated hi-fi showroom. To become an empire, PSB had to prove that the strict measurement culture of the National Research Council could scale up to the luxury audiophile market. The budget market forgave a cheap vinyl finish as long as the sound was accurate. The high-end market, however, demanded expensive wood veneers, towering physical presence, and the ability to reproduce the full, uncompressed dynamic scale of a symphony orchestra without distortion. If the acoustic science only worked in cheap boxes, the NRC philosophy would be dismissed as a budget gimmick. Paul Barton and PSB answered with the Stratus series, and specifically, the 1990 release of the Stratus Gold. The Stratus Gold was a massive floor-standing speaker, a tall, heavy cabinet designed to rest directly on the floor without a stand, allowing for a much larger internal air volume to reinforce deep, physical bass. It weighed over 90 pounds. It utilized a heavy 10-inch woofer, a large driver designed to reproduce low frequencies, capable of moving massive amounts of air in a large Canadian basement rec room or a dedicated home theater. But a large wooden box is inherently dangerous to accurate sound. The heavier the drivers, the more energy they push into the cabinet walls. If the wood vibrates, the cabinet itself becomes a crude, muddy instrument, masking the clarity of the music. Inside the NRC labs in Ottawa, Barton used laser interferometry, a technology that uses laser beams to measure microscopic physical vibrations, to perfectly map how the Stratus Gold's cabinet behaved under stress. He placed heavy aluminum extrusions in the corners. He braced the internal structure exactly where the mathematical resonances peaked. He engineered a complex, sophisticated crossover, an electrical network inside the speaker that sends the bass to the woofer, the mid-range to a dedicated driver, and the treble to the tweeter. When the Stratus Gold arrived at Canadian hi-fi dealers, it fundamentally disrupted the economics of luxury audio. Priced around $2,000 Canadian dollars, the Stratus Gold was placed in dedicated Montreal listening rooms and Toronto stereo boutiques directly alongside American and European flagship speakers costing over $6,000. In blind listening tests, the Canadian speaker routinely matched or defeated the expensive luxury imports. It threw a massive, three-dimensional soundstage, the perceived width, depth, and placement of the music, while maintaining an absolute, uncolored neutrality. It did not editorialize the sound. It merely presented the physical truth of the recording. But success at this level introduced a new, systemic tension. Building a perfect speaker inside a government anechoic chamber is an act of science. Building tens of thousands of 90-pound wooden cabinets, perfectly matching the veneers, and shipping them intact across North America is an act of brutal logistics. The heavy wood, the delicate crossovers, the massive magnets, shipping these physical objects from an Ontario assembly line to a dealer in Vancouver or a boutique in Chicago required an entirely different kind of power. Force 1, the relentless cost of components, labor, and domestic manufacturing, was threatening to choke the company's growth. PSB could not remain a standalone workshop if it wanted to feed the massive retail demand it had just created. It needed an industrial spine. This is where the Lenbrook Group changed the trajectory of the brand. Based in Pickering, Ontario, Lenbrook was a powerful, established Canadian distribution engine. They understood the complex plumbing of the audio retail market. By bringing PSB into the Lenbrook ecosystem, the brilliant acoustic engineering in Ottawa was suddenly married to world-class supply chain management, massive warehousing, and a vast network of international dealer relationships. Lenbrook provided the financial leverage and the logistical muscle to push the heavy wooden cabinets out of rural Ontario and onto the primary demonstration floors of the biggest audio retailers in the world. The scale of the operation expanded exponentially. By the mid-1990s, the Canadian speaker brand had achieved total market saturation. By the late 1990s, the partnership with the Lenbrook Group had transformed PSB from a respected acoustic laboratory into a North American retail juggernaut. Lenbrook's distribution machine allowed the exact mathematical truth formulated in the Ottawa anechoic chamber to be manufactured, boxed, and shipped at an unprecedented scale. The physical presence of the brand became inescapable. If a buyer walked into the sprawling Future Shop audio walls across Canada, they found rows of PSB Alpha and Century Series speakers. If a dedicated audiophile walked into Babelor Radio in Toronto, or independent stereo shops in Halifax, or boutique listening rooms in Vancouver, they found the premium Stratus series commanding the floor. The lineup expanded to capture every possible Canadian listening environment. The legendary Stratus Gold evolved into the Stratus Gold I, refining the crossover, the electrical network dividing frequencies between drivers, to extract even more detail. For listeners who could not fit a massive 90-pound cabinet into their homes, PSB released the Stratus Mini. It was a dense, heavy bookshelf speaker that attempted to squeeze the massive three-dimensional soundstage, the perceived width, depth, and physical placement of the music, of the flagship towers into a compact footprint designed for premium Montreal apartments and tight urban listening spaces. This era represented the absolute cultural peak of the traditional, passive two-channel hi-fi system. It was a time when the physical audio system was the undisputed focal point of domestic entertainment. A listener in a Calgary basement rec room would intentionally arrange their furniture around the stereo. They would place two heavy wooden cabinets exactly equidistant from a central listening chair. They would wire them to a high-current stereo receiver, an amplifier with a radio tuner and source controls built into the same unit. They would place a disc into a CD player, a machine that reads a compact disc and turns its digital data into music, sit down in the sweet spot, and do nothing but listen. The speakers were not background noise. They were primary furniture that demanded attention and physical space. The stakes during this expansion were absolute. If PSB and Lenbrook could maintain this level of retail dominance, Imanians Bessia the Canadian NRC measurement culture would not just survive as a respected academic theory, it would become the permanent, unassailable global standard for how commercial audio must be built. And for a few glorious years, it was. Major international publications like Stereophile and Sound and Vision continually used PSB products as the baseline benchmark for value and accuracy. If a new European luxury speaker or a massive American tower entered the market, it had to mathematically and musically justify why it cost thousands of dollars more than a Canadian box that measured perfectly flat in a government lab. Production lines were running at maximum capacity. Thousands of woofers with their delicate foam surrounds, the flexible ring around a woofer cone that lets it move in and out, were being bolted into heavily braced wooden cabinets. Vast shipping containers of speakers moved through the Lenbrook logistics network, supplying a golden era of stereo dealers whose profit margins relied entirely on demonstrating passive acoustic superiority to captive audiences. But this massive, thriving industrial system relied on one very specific, highly vulnerable consumer habit. It required the buyer's willingness to dedicate significant square footage to large, heavy, single-purpose wooden boxes. It required a culture that valued sitting still and listening to an amplifier push electrical current into a passive network. The measurement philosophy had conquered the passive hi-fi room. But outside those doors, the room itself was starting to disappear. The decline of the traditional Canadian hi-fi room did not begin with a sudden bankruptcy or a dramatic failure in the laboratory. It began quietly, in the late 1990s, on a Saturday afternoon inside a sprawling big-box retail store. A customer, holding a credit card, stood in front of a perfectly engineered pair of PSB floor-standing speakers. They listened to the flawless mid-range. They admired the heavy wood veneer. And then, they walked a few aisles over and purchased a cheap, plastic home theater-in-a-box system instead. The PSB cabinets were objectively superior in every measurable acoustic metric. But the customer no longer wanted to dedicate half of their living room to heavy wooden furniture. They simply wanted to hear the explosions on their new television. This was the first visible crack in the system. The physical geometry of the Canadian domestic space was fundamentally changing. For 3 decades, the stereo system had been the altar of the basement rec room and the primary living space. Furniture was intentionally arranged to point directly at the hi-fi. But as the home theater era accelerated, the television violently displaced the stereo pair as the focal point of the house. You could not easily place 2 90-pound Stratus Gold cabinets next to a massive tube television without ruining the room's sightlines and dominating the floor space. Simultaneously, the retail environment that had built the brand began to collapse. Canadian audio had relied on the hi-fi dealer, a dedicated stereo shop where audio components were actively demonstrated, compared and sold in quiet, controlled acoustic environments. In these rooms, the National Research Council measurement culture was an unbeatable weapon. A salesman could switch between a poorly designed import and a perfectly flat PSB speaker, and the customer could immediately hear the truth. But the market was shifting toward warehouse pricing and big-box retail. Stores like Future Shop fundamentally changed how audio was sold. In a massive retail warehouse with 30-foot steel ceilings, concrete floors, and the constant hum of washing machines and video game kiosks a few aisles away, critical listening was impossible. The brilliant engineering achieved inside the anechoic chamber, the completely dead reflection-free testing room in Ottawa, was entirely neutralized by the noise of the retail floor. When you cannot hear the subtle, mathematically perfect integration of a tweeter and a woofer, you stop paying a premium for it. The product did not only have to sound good, it had to survive the room where it was sold. And the new rooms were deafening. PSB adapted to the first wave of this disruption. They engineered highly accurate center channel speakers, a specific cabinet placed directly above or below a screen to anchor movie dialogue. They designed powerful subwoofers, a speaker designed exclusively to reproduce very low bass frequencies. They successfully transitioned their acoustic science into the 5.1 surround sound era. But survival in the home theater market triggered Force 1, the brutal reality of manufacturing costs. A traditional stereo buyer purchased 2 wooden cabinets. A home theater buyer required 5 cabinets, plus a heavy subwoofer, but they did not want to pay 3 times the price of a stereo pair. To hit these aggressive new retail price points, the massive Ontario industrial footprint had to change. Sourcing heavy wood, applying premium veneers, and paying domestic manufacturing wages for 6 separate boxes per customer was no longer economically viable. Like almost every other major North American brand, production slowly had to shift toward global supply chains and offshore manufacturing. The engineering brain remained fiercely Canadian. The physical assembly began to leave. Then came the technological shift that nearly erased the traditional speaker entirely: the flat-screen television. Older, deep televisions required deep entertainment units, which naturally left physical room for bookshelf speakers. But when televisions became thin panels mounted flush against drywall, buyers demanded audio solutions that were equally invisible. The market answered with the soundbar, a single wide speaker enclosure designed to sit directly beneath a screen, replacing multiple cabinets and complex wiring. For a company built on the science of internal cabinet volume and the precise physical placement of drivers in a room, the soundbar was a hostile format. A thin plastic tube cannot move air like a 10-inch woofer. It cannot create a true physical soundstage. But it was cheap, it was convenient, and it solved the aesthetic problem of the modern living room. The heavy, passive wooden cabinets that had defined Canadian audio dominance were suddenly being unhooked. Beautifully engineered PSB Stratus pairs were being carried out of living rooms, relegated to basement storage, or listed for fractions of their original price on Canuck Audio Mart and Kijiji. A receiver, an amplifier with a radio tuner and source controls built into the same unit, was suddenly viewed as a massive, ugly burden. Buyers did not want separate components anymore. They wanted a single wire connected to a wireless box. The physical footprint of audio was shrinking to zero. The wood was disappearing. The passive network was losing its reason to exist. The wooden cabinet was no longer enough to win the living room. The Canadian speaker had to learn how to compute. To understand how PSB survived the collapse of the passive stereo era, you have to look at the corporate structure behind it. The Lenbrook Group, headquartered in Pickering, Ontario, was not just a distribution engine pushing wooden boxes into retail stores. Lenbrook was an audio ecosystem. They also owned NAD Electronics, a legendary brand famous for building high-current, high-value amplifiers. And they were secretly developing BluOS, an advanced software platform designed for high-resolution streaming. As the traditional hi-fi dealer rooms vanished, replaced by online reviews and Amazon listings, the Lenbrook ecosystem provided a lifeline. For 30 years, the fundamental contract of a PSB speaker was that it was passive. It sat in a room, entirely silent, waiting for an external receiver to feed it power. But as buyers rejected the clutter of external amplifiers, thick copper cables, and dedicated audio racks, the Canadian speaker had to absorb the system around it. PSB began placing NAD amplifiers, electronic devices that increase a weak audio signal so it can drive speakers, directly inside the wooden cabinets. They integrated DSP, digital signal processing, software-based sound shaping inside an audio device to manipulate the audio signal before it even reached the drivers. This was a profound philosophical shift. In the 1980s, Paul Barton had used physical wood, carefully chosen foam surrounds, and heavy analog crossovers to force the speaker to measure perfectly in the National Research Council's anechoic chamber. Now, the acoustic problems of a cheap woofer or a small plastic cabinet could be fixed mathematically with software algorithms. The math had moved from the drafting table into the microchip. The physical objects changed. The iconic PSB Alpha bookshelf speaker was eventually reborn as a powered, all-in-one streaming speaker, a network audio device that receives music from online services or local files without needing any separate equipment. But the most dramatic transformation of the Canadian listening room was not the move to active speakers. It was the complete privatization of the listening experience. By the 2000s, the shared domestic stereo system was dying. Families no longer sat together in a basement rec room to listen to a new compact disc. Instead, audio became intensely solitary. The listening room shrank to the exact dimensions of a human skull. PSB responded by designing premium headphones. Barton took the exact same psychoacoustic data he had gathered at the NRC in the 1970s and applied it to the headphone market. He developed room feel technology, aiming to make a pair of headphones sound like two perfectly placed floor-standing speakers in an ideal acoustic environment. The acoustic science was still undeniably Canadian. The measurement culture remained fully intact. The brand had successfully navigated the most violent technological disruption in the history of consumer audio. But survival required abandoning the very physical objects that had made the company famous. Force 5, the relentless shift in listening culture, had fundamentally rewritten the rules of the living room. The massive, heavy, 90-pound Stratus Gold cabinets that once dominated Canadian retail showrooms were no longer being manufactured. The complex passive crossovers built by hand in Ontario were relics of a dead economic era. The audio dealers that had championed the brand in the 1990s were largely gone. Squeezed out by big box stores and then completely erased by online direct-to-consumer shopping, the traditional stereo shop became an endangered species. The company had survived, but the passive Canadian audio empire that built it had completely evaporated. The market changed, the heavy wood disappeared, the large cabinets were sold, the receivers were unplugged, the dealer rooms closed, the physical discs vanished, the software took over. The passive era died. The new buyer streamed. The old system was gone. The original Canadian listening room was empty, but the sound that defined it had simply found a new vessel. PSB Speakers did not collapse into bankruptcy. It did not become an empty, licensed badge slapped onto cheap imported televisions. Unlike so many legendary Canadian audio empires of the 20th century that were absorbed and stripped for parts, PSB survived. But it survived by fundamentally changing its physical relationship with the listener. Today, the brand thrives within the Lenbrook Group ecosystem. The defining product for a new generation of buyers is no longer a massive, passive wooden tower waiting for a heavy amplifier. It is something like the Alpha IQ, an active-powered streaming speaker, a network audio device that receives music from online services without needing any separate equipment. The Canadian acoustic science that Paul Barton pioneered in the 1970s is now permanently embedded into digital signal processing. The National Research Council measurement culture, the strict adherence to a flat frequency response and wide dispersion, did not die when the traditional hi-fi dealer closed. It simply migrated. The math was successfully transferred from analog crossovers into software algorithms. But out in the physical world, the remnants of the passive Canadian audio empire stubbornly refused to disappear. If you open Canuck Audio Mart, the primary online classified platform for Canadian audio enthusiasts, or browse the estate sales and Kijiji listings in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, you will find the physical evidence of the 1990s retail dominance. You will find massive 90-pound Stratus Gold cabinets being bought, sold, traded, and meticulously restored. You will find dedicated repair technicians carefully refoaming the original drivers, replacing a deteriorated foam surround on a woofer so the cone can move in and out freely again. You will find enthusiasts recapping the heavy analog networks, replacing old capacitors to restore the crossover to its original factory specifications. These heavy wooden boxes are not traded purely out of nostalgia. They survive because of a fundamental paradox in modern consumer electronics. A digital-to-analog converter, a DAC that turns digital data into an analog audio signal, built in 1998, is now functionally obsolete. A streamer built 5 years ago is likely incompatible with modern software. Digital ecosystems decay rapidly, but a wooden cabinet built around NRC psychoacoustic data in 1991 does not expire. Because it passes the not nostalgia test, a beautifully restored PSB Stratus Gold, connected to a proper high-current amplifier, can still reproduce the uncompressed dynamic scale of a symphony orchestra with a sheer physical force that no modern plastic soundbar can ever replicate. The woofer, a large driver designed to reproduce low frequencies, still hits with absolute authority. The stereo image, the illusion that sounds come from places between and around two speakers, remains mathematically precise. The original mass market buyers may have abandoned them for the convenience of streaming, but a new generation of audiophiles is dragging these heavy cabinets back out of basements to experience the absolute truth of a perfectly measured room. The physical sites that birthed this truth still exist. The Lenbrook offices in Pickering, Ontario, still coordinate global distribution, acting as the nerve center for a massive audio network. And more importantly, the anechoic chamber, the completely dead, reflection-free testing room designed to absorb all sound reflections, still sits quietly inside the National Research Council facility in Ottawa. It remains one of the most important acoustic laboratories on Earth. It is the room where the mythology of subjective audio was dismantled and replaced with objective Canadian engineering. There is also a surprise footnote to this corporate survival story. In an industry where founders are routinely pushed out after a global acquisition or a major technology shift, Paul Barton never left. Decades after driving his first wooden prototypes from rural St. Jacobs to the Ottawa government labs, he remains the chief acoustic designer for the brand. He is still measuring. He is still listening. He just applies the science to different formats, from noise-canceling headphones to architectural audio hidden in ceilings. The philosophical legacy of PSB is a profound lesson in the limits of physical perfection. For 30 years, the company operated on the belief that if you built a perfectly accurate speaker, the Canadian market would reward you. And for a long time, the market did. But the ultimate disruption was not a better-sounding speaker from a foreign competitor. The disruption was convenience. The traditional stereo buyers simply decided they no longer wanted to dedicate their living space to large wooden furniture. The speaker was still working flawlessly. The domestic listening room around it was disappearing. The science was correct. The math was flawless. The hardware was democratized. But objective truth is heavy, and the modern consumer wanted something light. Yet the passive era left behind physical monuments to that uncompromising pursuit of perfection. The original speakers are still out there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right electrical current to bring them back to life. Somewhere in a Canadian basement, a pair of heavy black ash Stratus cabinets still stands beside an old silver amplifier, the wood veneer slightly chipped, the grills intact, waiting for one more record to move the air in the room. Subscribe if that history matters to you. See you in the next one.